Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into an article called "The Failed Promises of Christianity and Islam: A Critique of Religious Rulers and the Path to Atheism."
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a mouthful.
it is. And it's a pretty bold statement too, don't you think? The article is basically saying that both Christianity and Islam, even though they started with good intentions, kind of went astray. And that's actually a big reason why we see more and more people moving towards atheism these days. So we are going to try to break down those arguments and look at the historical events, look at the theological ideas that are presented. And of course, we'll try to do it all without, taking sides or saying who's right or wrong.
Right. And I think that's what's so fascinating about this deep dive. The article takes on this really sensitive topic, right? By looking at the history and the role that both Christianity and Islam have played, throughout time up to today.
For sure. It definitely makes you think. So to start things off, the article lays out what the initial goals of both Christianity and Islam were. Kind of like, what were they hoping to achieve? What was their vision for a better world?
Well, if you look at Christianity, the focus was very much on love and compassion. Developing a deeper sense of spirituality, living a more ethical life.
Right.
And a lot of that is reflected in teachings like the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes.
Yeah, Beatitudes.
Yeah.
Those are like those blessings for specific virtues, right? Like, blessed are the peacemakers and all that.
Exactly. It's all about putting things like humility, mercy, striving for righteousness, those kinds of values at the forefront. Now, Islam, you have a really similar emphasis on justice. And we're talking about both spiritual justice and social justice. So in the Quran, and the Hadiths, which are, collections of sayings and traditions from the Prophet Muhammad, right? There's this big emphasis on creating a just society, a strong community based on knowledge and equality.
So it sounds like both religions, at their core, were promoting these really radical ideas for their time. Ideas that could really change how people lived and how they related to each other.
Oh, absolutely. But the article argues that there is this disconnect between what these religions promised and what actually happened. And that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
How do religions with such seemingly good goals end up being accused of falling short, of not living up to those ideals?
Yeah, that's the big question. And the article goes straight into the historical record of violence and conflict. And let's be honest, religion has a pretty complicated past when it comes to violence.
Yeah, it does. And the article points to some pretty specific examples. So on the Christian side, you've got things like the Crusades, where European Christians waged war to try and recapture the Holy Land.
Right.
Then there's the 30 Years' War, which was this incredibly brutal conflict fueled by religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants. And then, of course, you have the Spanish Inquisition, which was a period marked by a lot of persecution and violence against people who were considered heretics.
Right. And that is a pretty stark contrast to that message of love and forgiveness you find in those early Christian teachings. And unfortunately, the article doesn't paint a much better picture for Islam either.
No, it doesn't. It talks about the expansion of those early Islamic caliphates, those vast empires ruled by the successors to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, while expansion wasn't always solely driven by religious motives, it did often lead to, conflict and conquest. And then you've got more recent examples,
right,
like the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East where religion plays a role. And of course, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, who try to justify their violence through their own distorted interpretation of Islam.
It makes you wonder how religions that are supposed to be about peace and unity end up getting so caught up in violence.
It's a big question, for sure. I think it's important to note that the article isn't saying religion is inherently violent. It's more about how religion can be used and sometimes intentionally twisted to justify actions that actually go against its fundamental principles.
Okay, so it's not just the teachings themselves, but how they've been interpreted and maybe even manipulated over time.
Exactly. And that takes us to the next point. The article brings up the role of superstition and dogma. It argues that over time, both Christianity and Islam developed practices and beliefs that seem to contradict their original, pure forms.
Can you give some specific examples? Because, for someone who's not that familiar with these religions, superstition and dogma might sound kind of vague.
Sure. Let's take Christianity. The article brings up the concept of the Trinity, the idea that God exists as three distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But the article argues that this isn't spelled out clearly in the Bible. It may have developed later.
So it's a case of like interpretations and traditions evolving over time.
Yeah.
And maybe obscuring or even contradicting the original message.
Yeah, exactly. Another example is the veneration of saints, the practice of praying to certain holy individuals for intercession with God. Again, the article argues that this practice, while important in some branches of Christianity, isn't clearly supported by the Bible. And then you have things like indulgences, those payments made to the church to reduce punishment for sins,
Right.
which were heavily criticized during the Reformation. This is seen as an example of how religious institutions can stray from their spiritual mission for material gain.
So the article is saying that these religions, even though they started with good intentions, picked up these beliefs and practices that don't necessarily align with the original teachings.
Yeah, it's like, adding extra ingredients to a recipe and changing the flavor.
I like that analogy.
And in Islam, you see similar things. The article points to the use of talismans for protection or healing, the belief in jinn, those supernatural beings from folklore and magic, and a focus on rituals that aren't explicitly rooted in the Quran. Again, the argument is that these elements, while part of many Muslims' lived experience, might be deviations from the core principles of the faith.
It's fascinating how these religions have picked up these beliefs and practices over the centuries. It makes you wonder who's driving these changes. Is it just a natural evolution, or are there specific people involved?
And that's where the article really gets into the heart of the issue, the role of religious leaders.
Okay.
And this is where things get a bit more controversial because the article doesn't hold back in placing a lot of blame on these leaders for what it sees as the failures of these religions.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah.
So how exactly does the article implicate religious leaders in this failure?
The main point is that religious leaders have often distorted teachings, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, to serve their own agendas. Those could be personal agendas, political agendas, or agendas tied to the institution itself.
So it's not necessarily that the original teachings were bad, but that they were open to being twisted or manipulated by those in power.
Exactly. And the article gives examples from both Christianity and Islam to make this point. On the Christian side, it talks about how interpretations of the Bible have been used to justify things like slavery, colonialism, and the oppression of certain groups.
Right.
Which, of course, goes against the core message of equality and love.
It really shows how scripture can be used to support completely different agendas depending on who's doing the interpreting. And I imagine the article points to similar issues within Islam.
Oh, absolutely. It talks about how some Islamic leaders throughout history and even today have interpreted the Quran and the Hadiths to justify violence and terrorism. Yeah, that's a really serious accusation. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, how does that even work?
So the article focuses on the concept of jihad, which often gets translated as struggle or striving, like a spiritual or personal effort. But some extremist groups have taken this concept and twisted it.
Right.
They use it to justify violence, even declaring war on anyone they consider an enemy of Islam. And the article is arguing that these interpretations are a complete distortion of the real meaning of jihad, and that it's been used by some leaders to gain power or push their own political agendas.
It's scary how easily religion can be manipulated to serve purposes that seem totally opposite to its core message.
Right.
And it makes you think about leadership, interpretation, and the responsibility that comes with religious authority.
It really does. And we haven't even touched on the infighting, the power struggles between different groups within these religions,
Right.
which the article argues have also contributed to this perception of failure.
Yeah, that's a whole other layer to this, isn't it? The conflicts within the religions themselves.
Exactly. It's not just about clashes with the outside world, but also the disagreements and power struggles happening within these faiths. It's a big part of the story.
So let's dig into that a bit. Where do we even start? I'm guessing the article has some examples.
It does. For Christianity, a big turning point was the Protestant Reformation.
Oh, yeah.
This was a huge upheaval back in the 16th century,
Okay.
led by figures like Martin Luther.
Right.
They challenged the authority of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in history class. It always seems so complicated, though, all those theological debates and political moves. Can you break it down for us?
Well, the Reformation was sparked by a lot of things. There were concerns about corruption within the church, disagreements about how to interpret the Bible. Luther and other reformers, they questioned practices like the selling of indulgences. They argued for a more personal relationship with God, based on Scripture, not just the church hierarchy.
It was about challenging the power structure of the church and saying, hey, faith should be more personal, less about institutions.
Exactly. And this challenge led to a split in Christianity. You had different Protestant denominations popping up, each with their own take on the Bible and how to practice their faith. And, of course, the split didn't happen peacefully. The Reformation led to decades of conflict, wars, even persecution across Europe.
It's sad how something that started as a call for reform and getting back to core values ended up causing so much division and bloodshed.
Yeah, it is. And it shows how easily religious disagreements, especially when they're tied to power and politics, can turn violent and oppressive. Now, within Islam, a major division is the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims. This goes all the way back to the 7th century.
Oh, wow.
And it's about who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Muslim community.
I've heard about the Sunni-Shia divide, but I'll be honest, I'm not totally clear on the details. What are the main differences between them?
Okay, so basically, Sunnis believe that the rightful successors to Muhammad were the elected caliphs who came after him, while Shia Muslims believe that leadership should have gone directly to Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law.
I see.
So it's this fundamental difference in who they see as the legitimate line of authority.
Right.
And it led to them developing separate traditions and interpretations of Islamic law.
So it's a disagreement over who has the right to interpret and lead the Muslim community.
Exactly. And this division has had huge effects throughout Islamic history, often causing conflicts and political maneuvering. Even today, the Sunni-Shia divide is a factor in conflicts in the Middle East, like the rivalry between Saudi Arabia, which is mostly Sunni, and Iran, which is predominantly Shia.
It's amazing how a theological debate from centuries ago can still have such a big impact today.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, and it really highlights how religion, politics, and power are all intertwined.
For sure.
These internal divisions, along with the external conflicts we talked about, all feed into the article's main argument about the failed promises of these religions. It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
It does. We've gone from those utopian ideals of love, justice, and unity to a reality of violence, internal fighting, and competing interpretations that are used to justify power grabs or even oppression. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot. But the article doesn't just end with despair. It goes on to explore the impact of these failed promises on modern society. And it offers some ideas about potential ways forward.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those ripple effects. How does the article connect these historical and theological problems to the world today?
One of the biggest impacts is the loss of unity, both within and between these religions. All that history of conflict and division, the ongoing power struggles, the different interpretations, they've all created a sense of mistrust and fragmentation.
Yeah, it's like those old wounds never quite healed, and then something happens, they just get ripped open again.
Exactly. And this lack of unity makes it really tough to deal with the problems we face today, the ones that need cooperation and understanding between different religious groups.
Right. Can you give us some examples of how this plays out in the real world?
Sure. The article talks about the tense relationship between some Christian and Muslim communities, especially in places where historical conflicts or political tensions have made those religious differences even worse. Like in parts of the Middle East, there's deep mistrust between those groups, fueled by old grudges, political rivalries, and often, inflammatory speeches from religious leaders on both sides.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mistrust just leads to more mistrust.
Exactly. And it has real consequences.
Yeah.
It makes peace building in conflict zones so much harder. It makes it harder to address global challenges like climate change or poverty. And it creates an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that can be exploited by people who want to divide us.
So these religious conflicts, both internal and external, really do spill over into the wider world, affecting everything from individual communities to international relations.
Absolutely. And the article goes even further, linking these issues to the rise of secularism and atheism. It's arguing that all this baggage, the violence, the hypocrisy has turned people off from religion altogether.
Right. And this is where the article's title really comes in. How does it connect those failed promises to the fact that more and more people are turning away from religion?
Well, it suggests that a lot of people have become disillusioned with religion because of its history of violence and oppression. Like, when you see the flaws in something you used to admire, it's harder to reconcile that with the idealized version you had in mind.
Right, so it's not just about the teachings, but about how they've actually been practiced, often in ways that contradict those messages of love and justice.
Exactly. And then there's the tension between religion and science. The article points out that a lot of people, especially those who value reason and evidence-based knowledge, find certain religious doctrines hard to square with a modern scientific worldview.
I can see how that would be a sticking point for people. It's like trying to fit two different puzzle pieces together that just don't quite match.
Exactly. And this clash has contributed to the rise in people identifying as secular or atheist. They see organized religion as outdated, dogmatic, even harmful, and they're finding meaning and purpose in other ways.
It's a complex issue, for sure, and it reflects those bigger shifts happening in how people see the world and what they value. So we've got this picture of religions struggling to live up to their promises, dealing with internal conflicts, and facing more and more people turning away. It seems pretty bleak. Does the article offer any solutions? Or at least some ways to approach these challenges?
It does. It's critical, but not entirely pessimistic. It says that acknowledging these failures, the history, the systemic issues, is the first step towards finding a better way forward.
Right, like admitting you have a problem before you can start fixing it.
Exactly. The article actually suggests a few paths forward for both individuals and religious institutions.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those suggestions?
One of the most important things is critical thinking and personal responsibility.
Okay.
It argues that blindly following dogma or leaders without questioning has contributed to a lot of these problems.
So it's about encouraging people to really engage with their faith, to question things that seem wrong, and to hold their leaders accountable.
Exactly. It's about developing a deeper, more nuanced understanding of your own faith.
Right.
Recognizing that interpretations can differ and that no one has a monopoly on truth.
It's like saying, don't just take someone's word for it, even if they're in a position of authority. Really examine the teachings, wrestle with those tough questions, and figure things out for yourself.
I love that. It's about developing a sense of independence intellectually and spiritually. And this applies to religious institutions too, not just individuals.
What do you mean? What kind of changes does it suggest for organized religion?
It calls for more transparency, more accountability,
Right.
a willingness to confront the uncomfortable parts of their history. They need to admit their role in perpetuating harmful interpretations or practices and really try to change those things that don't align with our core values anymore.
So it's about owning up to the harm that's been done in the name of religion and making a real effort to do better.
Exactly. And it also means being more open to dialogue, both within and between different faiths. The article argues that this us versus them mentality, this demonizing the other, has really held us back.
Yeah, it's hard to build bridges if you think the other side is the enemy. So how do we get past that kind of thinking?
Well, the article says it starts with empathy, with remembering that we're all human.
Right.
It's about engaging in respectful conversations, listening to each other, and finding common ground, even when we disagree.
That sounds great in theory, but with all that history and tension, it seems really difficult. Are there any practical ways to promote that kind of dialogue?
The article highlights the role of grassroots initiatives. Interfaith groups, community organizations, individuals working to connect people from different faiths.
So it's about creating those spaces where people can come together, share their stories, and learn from each other.
Exactly. It's about building relationships, breaking down those stereotypes. These efforts, even if they seem small, can have a big impact.
Right. It's a reminder that change often starts at the local level.
Definitely. And the article also talks about the importance of education, both religious and secular.
Okay.
A better understanding of different religions can help clear up misconceptions and make people more tolerant.
So giving people the knowledge and critical thinking skills to deal with these complex issues in a more thoughtful way.
Exactly. And this can happen in schools, universities, community centers, even online. It's about having those open and honest conversations about religion, its history, its impact, both good and bad.
Right, going beyond those oversimplified stories and really grappling with the complexities.
Yeah, and ultimately, the article says that to really address these failed promises, we need a fundamental shift in perspective, both as individuals and as a society.
What kind of shift?
Moving away from rigid dogma and blind faith towards a more open, compassionate, and reasoned approach to spirituality. It's about recognizing the value of every person, regardless of their beliefs, and working together to create a better world.
That's a powerful idea. And I think it speaks to a lot of people, regardless of their faith.
I think so too. And even with its criticisms, the article does offer a message of hope. It's suggesting that we can learn from our past mistakes, challenge harmful interpretations, and make religion a force for good.
It's definitely a challenge, but also a really inspiring call to action. It makes me think about that question you posed earlier. Does understanding these challenges facing Christianity and Islam make you more or less likely to seek guidance from organized religion?
That's a question each listener has to answer for themselves. But hopefully this deep dive has given everyone some things to think about, some new perspectives, maybe even some hope. Whether you stay within a religious tradition or find meaning elsewhere, it's about finding what resonates with you.
Well said. And that's what the deep dive is all about, encouraging curiosity, critical thinking, and a love of learning. So to our listeners, keep exploring these ideas, think critically about your own beliefs, and look for those places where dialogue and understanding can grow.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been great.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth wherever it might lead you.